May 5, 1873. Dr. William York had been missing for 3 weeks when his brother, Colonel Alexander York, arrived in southeastern Kansas with a team of investigators. What they discovered beneath the floorboards of an abandoned inn near Cherryvale would become one of America's most chilling serial murder cases. 11 bodies, methodically buried in a makeshift graveyard behind a modest 2-story building where travelers once sought refuge. The perpetrators had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only blood-stained hammers, a trap door stained with human remains, and the disturbing reputation of a young woman named Kate Bender, a self-proclaimed spiritualist who claimed she could speak with the dead. For over 2 decades, the Bender family had operated their deadly enterprise along one of Kansas Territory's busiest trails, and Kate had been their most valuable asset. Before we continue with the story of Kate Bender and the horror that unfolded in Labette County, I want to hear from you. Subscribe to our channel if you have not already, and leave a comment telling me which state you are listening from. Your support helps us bring these forgotten American mysteries to light. The question that haunted investigators then, and continues to perplex historians today, is how 4 people managed to murder at least 11 victims over more than 20 years without arousing serious suspicion from their community. The answer lies in the carefully constructed deception orchestrated by Kate Bender herself, a woman whose intelligence, charm, and ruthless cunning made her the perfect predator for America's untamed frontier. The Kansas Territory of the 1870s was a harsh and unforgiving landscape where survival often depended on the kindness of strangers. Southeastern Kansas in particular had become a crossroads for westward expansion, with the Osage Mission Trail serving as a vital artery for settlers, cattle drivers, and fortune seekers heading toward Colorado and California. This dusty, rutted road cut through endless miles of prairie grass, broken only by occasional groves of cottonwood trees along creek beds and the distant silhouettes of homesteads scattered across the horizon like lonely islands in an ocean of grassland. Small communities dotted the prairie every 20 to 30 miles, offering essential services to weary travelers. Fresh horses, hot meals, and a roof over their heads for the night. These settlements typically consisted of little more than a general store, a blacksmith shop, perhaps a saloon, and a handful of modest dwellings clustered around a single dusty main street. The nearest doctor might be 50 miles away, the closest law enforcement officer even farther, and communication between settlements relied on occasional mail carriers and traveling merchants who might not pass through for weeks at a time. Labette County was typical of this frontier region, sparsely populated, with settlers scattered across homesteads that could be miles apart from their nearest neighbors. The isolation was both a blessing and a curse for frontier families. It provided freedom from the social constraints and economic pressures of more established communities, but it also meant that help was rarely close at hand when trouble arose. Neighbors might not see each other for months during harsh winter weather, and the disappearance of a traveler along one of the lonely prairie roads might not be noticed until it was far too late to mount an effective search. The nearest law enforcement might be days away by horseback, and even when authorities could be contacted, their ability to investigate crimes across the vast distances of the frontier was severely limited. County sheriffs typically had jurisdiction over areas larger than some eastern states, and their resources were stretched impossibly thin. Communication between settlements relied on occasional mail carriers and traveling merchants, creating delays of weeks or months before information about missing persons could be shared between communities. In such an environment, a family operating a roadside inn held a position of significant trust and responsibility within their community. Innkeepers served as informal sources of news and information, sharing reports about trail conditions, weather patterns, and the general safety of travel routes with their guests. They often served as unofficial bankers, holding valuable items or money for travelers who feared carrying large sums through dangerous territory. Most importantly, they provided a crucial link in the chain of hospitality that made long-distance travel possible across the American frontier. It was into this world that the Bender family arrived sometime in the late 1860s. though their exact origins remained mysteriously vague even to their closest neighbors. John Bender, a man in his 60s with a thick German accent and limited English, purchased a 160-acre homestead about 8 miles northeast of the growing town of Cherryvale. The property sat strategically along the well-traveled Osage Mission Trail, positioned at a natural stopping point where the road crested a small hill before descending into a shallow valley. Travelers approaching from either direction could see the Bender house from miles away, its whitewashed walls and red roof standing out against the endless expanse of prairie grass. With him came his wife, Elvira, a stern woman in her 50s who rarely spoke to strangers and seemed to regard all visitors with barely concealed suspicion. Local residents who attempted to engage her in conversation found her responses limited to grunts and nods, leading many to assume she spoke little or no English. Her demeanor was so consistently unfriendly that most travelers quickly learned to conduct their business directly with other family members, avoiding unnecessary interaction with the intimidating older woman. The Bender household also included 2 adult children. John Jr., a slow-witted man in his 20s who appeared to suffer from some form of mental impairment, and Kate, an attractive woman of about 24 who would become the face of their operation. John Jr. was physically powerful, but seemed incapable of complex thought or conversation, often staring blankly at visitors while his sister conducted business. His primary responsibilities appeared to involve heavy labor around the property, and neighbors occasionally hired him for tasks requiring physical strength but little mental acuity. Kate Bender possessed qualities that made her uniquely suited for frontier hospitality, or so it seemed to the unsuspecting travelers who encountered her. Unlike her heavily accented father and taciturn mother, Kate spoke fluent English with only the slightest trace of a German accent, suggesting she had received considerably more education than was typical for immigrant families of their economic status. She was articulate, charming when she chose to be, and possessed a striking appearance that turned heads in their conservative rural community. Standing nearly 6 feet tall with dark hair that she wore in elaborate styles unusual for frontier women, and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look straight through those she encountered, Kate commanded attention wherever she went. But it was Kate's claimed spiritual abilities that truly set her apart from other innkeepers' daughters in the region. She advertised herself as a medium and healer, claiming she could communicate with the spirits of the deceased and provide herbal remedies for various ailments. In an era when spiritualism was gaining popularity across America, particularly among women grieving losses from the recent Civil War, Kate's services attracted visitors from considerable distances. Her reputation spread through word of mouth among travelers, who would often make special detours to visit the Bender Inn, hoping to receive messages from departed loved ones or guidance about important decisions in their lives. The Bender home itself was a modest 2-story structure, typical of frontier construction, but arranged in an unusual manner that would later prove significant to investigators. Built from locally quarried limestone with thick walls designed to provide protection from prairie storms and winter cold, the house appeared solid and welcoming to approaching travelers. The ground floor served multiple purposes. The front section operated as a general store where travelers could purchase supplies, ammunition, and provisions for their journeys, while the rear portion functioned as a dining room and temporary lodging area for overnight guests. A canvas wagon cover hung from the ceiling, dividing the main room and creating a sense of privacy between the store area and the family's living space. What made the Bender establishment particularly appealing to travelers was its reasonable prices and Kate's reputation for providing entertainment along with meals and lodging. She would regale guests with stories of her spiritual experiences, offer to read their fortunes using cards or palm reading techniques, or conduct elaborate seances for those seeking contact with deceased relatives. Many visitors left impressed by her apparent abilities and spread word of the remarkable young woman who could bridge the gap between the living and the dead. The family's business model seemed sound, and their reputation in the community was generally positive. Local residents regarded them as hard-working German immigrants, making an honest living serving travelers, contributing to the economic development of their rapidly growing region. Kate, in particular, had cultivated relationships with several prominent local men, and there was frequent speculation about potential marriages. She attended social gatherings when invited, contributed to community discussions about establishing schools and churches in the rapidly growing area, and even participated in fundraising efforts for various civic improvements. Dr. William York's disappearance in March 1873 would prove to be the catalyst that unraveled the Bender family's carefully constructed facade. But it was far from the first suspicious vanishing along that stretch of the Osage Mission Trail. For several years, travelers had occasionally gone missing between townships, their disappearances attributed to the numerous dangers of frontier life. Indian raids that still occurred despite peace treaties, attacks by wild animals including wolves and bears that roamed the prairie, encounters with bandits who preyed on isolated travelers, or simply losing their way in the vast expanse of grassland where a wrong turn could lead to days of wandering without finding shelter or water. The frequency of such disappearances had actually increased over the previous 5 years, but this pattern went largely unnoticed because communication between far-flung communities was so poor and irregular. A merchant who failed to arrive at his destination might be presumed to have changed his travel plans or encountered weather delays. A family traveling to establish a new homestead might simply be assumed to have settled in a different location than originally intended. In the chaotic environment of westward expansion, people appeared and disappeared with such regularity that tracking individual movements required more coordination than most frontier communities could manage. Dr. William York was different from the typical frontier traveler in several important respects. As a respected physician practicing in Fort Scott, he maintained regular schedules and professional appointments that made his movements predictable and his absence quickly noticeable. He was also the brother of Colonel Alexander York, a prominent Kansas politician with the resources and connections necessary to mount a serious investigation when family members went missing. Most importantly, Dr. York carried himself with the confidence of an educated professional who was accustomed to being treated with respect, making him less likely to be intimidated by frontier dangers or to change his travel plans without good reason. Dr. York was traveling from Fort Scott to Independence when he stopped at the Bender Inn on the evening of March 9, 1873. Contemporary accounts describe him as a well-dressed man in his 40s, riding a fine horse and carrying leather saddlebags that clearly contained valuable medical instruments and supplies. As was his custom when traveling between settlements, he carried considerable money to purchase additional medical supplies and equipment that might not be available in smaller communities. Several witnesses had seen him at the inn that evening, engaged in animated conversation with Kate Bender about his destination and the purpose of his journey. The doctor had arrived at the Bender Inn just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the prairie and making further travel dangerous on the poorly marked trail. Kate had greeted him warmly, expressing interest in his medical practice and asking detailed questions about his work treating frontier families. She claimed to have some knowledge of herbal remedies and healing techniques, suggesting they might have much to discuss over dinner. Dr. York, who was known to enjoy intellectual conversation during his travels, seemed pleased to encounter someone with whom he could discuss his profession. During the evening meal, Kate had entertained Dr. York with stories of her spiritual experiences and offered to conduct a reading that might provide guidance about his future medical practice. According to later witness accounts, she had seemed particularly interested in learning about his travel schedule, asking whether he maintained regular routes between specific communities and how often his absence might be noticed if he failed to arrive at scheduled appointments. At the time, these questions seemed like natural conversation from a hostess interested in her guest's profession. The doctor never reached Independence. When Dr. York failed to arrive at his scheduled appointments the following day, concern quickly spread among his colleagues and patients who depended on his medical services. Unlike the typical traveler whose absence might not be noticed for weeks, Dr. York's failure to appear for scheduled patient visits was immediately recognized as highly unusual behavior. Search parties were organized within hours, and inquiries were made at every inn, trading post and settlement along his intended route. The Bender family reported that Dr. York had indeed stayed at their establishment, but had departed early the following morning, continuing westward toward his destination. They claimed he had seemed anxious to make up time after his late start and had refused their offers of breakfast, preferring to eat on the trail. Kate, in particular, seemed genuinely concerned about his welfare and offered to conduct a spiritual session to determine his fate, claiming her psychic abilities might reveal what had happened to the missing physician. During the séance, held in the presence of several concerned community members who had joined the search effort, Kate claimed to receive messages from the spirit realm indicating that Dr. York had encountered danger somewhere west of their location. She spoke in an otherworldly voice that was dramatically different from her normal speaking tone, describing detailed visions of the doctor being attacked by hostile Indians or falling victim to bandits near the Colorado border. Her performance was so convincing and emotionally affecting that several witnesses were moved to tears, and it successfully deflected suspicion from the Bender family while redirecting search efforts toward more distant locations. But Dr. York's brother, Colonel Alexander York, was not easily satisfied by spiritual communications or second-hand accounts of his brother's supposed fate. A Civil War veteran with investigative experience gained during years of military service, the colonel arrived in Labette County with a team of associates determined to trace his brother's exact movements and uncover the truth about his disappearance. Their methodical, systematic approach would soon expose inconsistencies in the Bender family's account that raised increasingly disturbing questions. The colonel's investigation revealed that several other travelers had vanished along the same stretch of road over the past few years, though the disappearances had never been connected because they occurred in different seasons and involved people from various backgrounds. George Lonchar, a German immigrant carrying his life savings in gold coins sewn into his clothing, had disappeared in 1871 while traveling to establish a new homestead. Ben Brown, a cattle driver with a substantial money belt containing payment for a large herd delivery, had vanished in 1872 after being seen at various stops along the Osage Mission Trail. A family named Mackenzie, father, mother, and young daughter, had disappeared without a trace while traveling to Kansas from Iowa. Their wagon and possessions never found despite extensive searches. In each case, the missing persons had last been seen at or near the Bender Inn, though this connection had not been recognized because the disappearances occurred months or years apart and were investigated by different local authorities who rarely shared information across county lines. When Colonel York compiled this information and presented it to local officials, a disturbing pattern became impossible to ignore. The investigation into Kate Bender's background revealed a complex web of deception that extended far beyond her family's roadside inn and suggested a criminal enterprise that had been operating across multiple states for years. As Colonel York and his team dug deeper into the Bender family's history, they uncovered evidence indicating that Kate's reputation as a spiritualist had been carefully cultivated as part of a larger criminal operation that may have claimed dozens of victims throughout the American frontier. Records from surrounding counties showed that a woman matching Kate's distinctive physical description and using variations of her name had operated similar spiritual consultation services in at least 3 different locations across Kansas and Missouri during the previous 5 years. In each case, she had established herself in communities along major travel routes, building a reputation for her alleged psychic abilities while maintaining connections to family members who operated hospitality businesses that catered to travelers carrying valuable goods or substantial amounts of cash. In Parsons, Kansas, a woman calling herself Kate Gebhardt had conducted seances and offered herbal remedies from a small shop attached to a boarding house operated by her relatives between 1868 and 1870. Local newspaper archives contained multiple advertisements for her services, describing her as a gifted medium with extraordinary powers of spiritual communication and healing. The advertisements promised that she could provide messages from departed loved ones, guidance for important life decisions, and miraculous cures for ailments that confound conventional medicine. Several former residents remembered her as an attractive, well-spoken woman who had claimed to receive visions about the fates of missing persons in their area, often providing specific details that seemed to confirm her supernatural abilities. During her time in Parsons, Kate Gebhardt had attracted a devoted following of clients who credited her with providing comfort during times of grief and guidance during difficult periods in their lives. However, her stay in the community coincided with a troubling series of unexplained disappearances among travelers passing through the region. At least 4 individuals, all known to be carrying substantial amounts of money or valuable goods, had vanished without a trace while traveling routes that would have taken them past the boarding house where Kate operated. She had left town suddenly in the spring of 1870, claiming to have received a spiritual calling to travel westward, abandoning clients who had prepaid for future consultations. Similarly, in Chautauqua, Kansas, a woman identified as Kate Miller had operated a fortune-telling business from a boarding house run by her relatives between 1870 and 1871. Local residents remembered her as offering similar services to those she had provided in Parsons, but with an expanded repertoire that included palm reading, card interpretation, and elaborate spiritual ceremonies that drew participants from considerable distances. Her reputation for accuracy in predicting future events had attracted wealthy clients who were willing to pay substantial fees for private consultations. Again, her stay coincided with the mysterious vanishing of several visitors to the area, including a wealthy cattle buyer named James Patterson, who had been known to carry large sums of cash for purchasing livestock. Patterson had been seen entering the boarding house for a spiritual consultation on the evening before his planned departure, but he had never emerged. When concerned associates investigated the following day, they were told that Patterson had received an urgent spiritual message directing him to travel immediately to Colorado, where he would find exceptional business opportunities. Kate Miller had disappeared from Chautauqua that same night, leaving behind only a note claiming she had received a divine vision calling her to establish a spiritual mission in western Kansas. These discoveries painted a picture of Kate Bender as potentially the most dangerous member of what appeared to be a highly mobile criminal family that had been operating across the frontier for years. Rather than establishing a permanent base of operations, they seemed to have moved systematically from location to location, setting up temporary enterprises that allowed them to identify and eliminate wealthy targets before moving on when suspicion grew too intense or local authorities began asking uncomfortable questions. Kate's role as a spiritualist provided the perfect cover for gathering detailed intelligence about potential victims while maintaining the trust and respect of the communities where her family operated. Her alleged psychic abilities gave her a plausible reason to ask personal questions about her clients' financial circumstances, family situations, and travel plans. The intimate nature of spiritual consultations created an environment where people felt compelled to share private information that could be used to determine their suitability as victims. More disturbing was the evidence suggesting that Kate's spiritual performances were sophisticated psychological manipulations designed to identify and isolate victims while building her reputation as a legitimate psychic medium. Former clients who had survived encounters with her described a consistent pattern of questioning disguised as spiritual communication. She would claim to receive messages from deceased relatives that contained specific requests for information about the living person's current circumstances, future plans, and financial resources. The investigation also revealed that Kate had studied the techniques of professional mentalists and spiritualists who toured the frontier circuit, learning the tricks of cold reading, seance manipulation, and psychological suggestion that allowed her to convince clients she possessed genuine supernatural abilities. She possessed an extensive library of books on spiritualism, mentalism, and herbal medicine that she had apparently studied intensively to perfect her deceptive skills. Rather than possessing genuine psychic abilities, she had spent years developing the knowledge and techniques necessary to convince others that she could communicate with the dead. Most chilling was the discovery that Kate had maintained detailed records of her clients and their spiritual sessions, information that she used to select suitable victims and plan their murders. These records, found hidden in a secret compartment built into the wall of her bedroom, contained personal information about dozens of individuals, including detailed notes about their financial circumstances, family situations, travel patterns, and psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited during the killing process. Many of the names in her notes corresponded to missing persons reported throughout Kansas and Missouri during the previous decade, suggesting that the Bender family's criminal activities extended far beyond their current location and had been ongoing for much longer than anyone had previously suspected. The records also contained detailed descriptions of murder methods, disposal techniques, and strategies for avoiding detection that indicated a level of criminal sophistication rarely seen on the American frontier. As the scope of Kate's deception became clear, Colonel York realized they were dealing with something far more sinister than a single instance of highway robbery that had escalated to violence. The Bender family appeared to be part of a sophisticated criminal network that had been systematically preying on travelers throughout the frontier region for years, with Kate serving as the primary recruiter who identified suitable victims and orchestrated their elimination. The tension in Labette County reached a breaking point when Colonel York announced his intention to conduct a thorough search of the Bender property, backed by legal authority from the territorial government and supported by a growing number of local residents who had become convinced of the family's guilt. Local authorities, initially reluctant to interfere with what appeared to be a respectable business operation, found themselves under increasing pressure as evidence of the family's involvement in multiple disappearances continued to accumulate, and community sentiment turned decidedly against the Benders. Kate Bender's response to the announced search revealed the first significant cracks in her carefully maintained facade of innocence and spiritual devotion. Rather than welcoming the opportunity to clear her family's name and demonstrate their innocence, she became visibly agitated and began making increasingly desperate and contradictory claims about spiritual interference and otherworldly threats. She told community members that malevolent spirits were angry about the investigation and had warned her of terrible consequences if the search proceeded, claiming that disturbing the spiritual energies around their property could result in curses being placed on the investigators and their families. During this period of mounting pressure, several local residents came forward with information they had previously dismissed as unimportant or had been reluctant to share due to their relationships with the Bender family. Martha Stevens, who lived on a neighboring homestead about 2 miles from the Bender property, reported seeing the Bender men digging in their orchard at odd hours, often working by lantern light in the middle of the night when most farmers would be sleeping. She had assumed they were planting additional fruit trees or maintaining their garden, but the timing and secrecy of their activities now seemed suspicious, particularly since the work appeared to involve digging holes rather than planting crops. Samuel Rogers, a traveling merchant who had stayed at the Bender Inn multiple times over the previous 2 years, described Kate's increasingly unusual behavior during his visits and her persistent interest in his cargo and financial arrangements. She had asked detailed questions about his business dealings, trade routes, and the valuable goods he transported, often pressing for information about which items were most profitable and where he obtained his merchandise. During his most recent stay, he had awakened in the middle of the night to find her standing over his belongings in the sleeping area. But she had quickly claimed she was checking to ensure his possessions were secure from theft by other travelers. Most disturbing was the testimony of Thomas McBride, a local farmer who had occasionally hired John Bender Jr. for heavy labor on his property and had been disturbed by several comments the young man had made during their work together. McBride reported that the younger Bender had made unprompted remarks about death and violence, including detailed descriptions of how someone might kill another person without leaving obvious evidence or being detected by authorities. The comments had included specific information about human anatomy and the most effective ways to cause fatal injuries. knowledge that seemed inappropriate for someone of his apparent mental limitations and social background. At the time, McBride had attributed these disturbing statements to the young man's apparent intellectual deficiencies and his exposure to violence during hunting or livestock slaughter, but they now took on a much more sinister significance in light of the missing persons investigation. John Jr. had also made several references to people who had gone to join the spirits, and expressed what seemed like inappropriate satisfaction when discussing the concept of death as a transition to another realm. As pressure mounted from the investigation, Kate made several increasingly desperate attempts to manipulate the situation through her alleged spiritual abilities, organizing elaborate seances designed to prove her family's innocence and redirect suspicion toward other potential suspects. These performances became notably more theatrical and emotionally intense than her previous spiritual demonstrations, suggesting a woman who realized her usual methods of deception were failing and was becoming increasingly desperate to maintain her credibility. During one particularly dramatic session, held in the presence of several community leaders, Kate claimed to channel the spirit of Dr. York himself, speaking in a dramatically altered voice and providing detailed information about his supposed fate at the hands of bandits operating far from the Bender property. However, several inconsistencies in her performance raised questions among observers who were familiar with Dr. York's personal life and professional habits. She provided information about his medical practice that proved to be inaccurate, made references to family members who did not exist, and described aspects of his personality that contradicted the experiences of people who had known him well. The investigation took a crucial turn when Colonel York obtained official permission to conduct a comprehensive search of the Bender house and property, supported by a team of volunteers from surrounding communities and backed by territorial law enforcement officers who had traveled from Topeka specifically to assist with the investigation. The search was scheduled for May 5, 1873, and word of the impending investigation spread rapidly throughout the region, drawing curious spectators from considerable distances who wanted to witness the resolution of what had become the most notorious criminal case in Kansas Territory history. For Kate Bender, this represented the ultimate test of whether her years of deception and manipulation could withstand systematic scrutiny from trained investigators who were not susceptible to her usual techniques of misdirection and psychological manipulation. The announced search would involve examination of every room in the house, excavation of suspicious areas on the property, and detailed questioning of each family member under circumstances where evasion and spiritual theatrics would not be acceptable responses. But on the morning of May 4th, just hours before the scheduled search was set to begin, something unexpected occurred that would fundamentally change the entire nature of the case and transform it from a criminal investigation into one of the largest manhunts in American frontier history. A neighbor riding past the Bender property at dawn noticed that no smoke was rising from the chimney and no signs of life were visible around the normally busy inn, an observation that seemed unusual since the family typically began their daily activities before sunrise. When he stopped to investigate more closely, he found the building completely abandoned, with clear evidence that the family had departed hastily during the night, taking only the most essential possessions and leaving behind valuable items that suggested panic rather than planned relocation. The discovery that the Bender family had vanished as completely as many of their victims would soon reveal the full extent of their crimes, while ensuring that many questions about their activities would never be definitively answered. The abandoned Bender Inn presented investigators with a scene that would haunt those present for the rest of their lives, revealing evidence of systematic violence that defied the comprehension of even experienced law enforcement officers who had dealt with frontier crime throughout their careers. As Colonel York and his team conducted their methodical search of the property, each new discovery added another horrifying layer to their understanding of what had transpired within those seemingly ordinary walls over more than 2 decades of operation. The first major breakthrough came when investigators noticed dark, irregular stains on the wooden floorboards near the canvas partition that divided the main room of the inn. The stains, which had been partially concealed by strategically placed rugs and furniture, showed distinctive patterns consistent with large quantities of blood that had seeped between the wooden planks and soaked into the underlying support beams. The location of the stains, directly beneath where guests would have been seated at the dining table, suggested that multiple violent incidents had occurred in the same specific area over an extended period. When investigators pried up the blood-stained floorboards using crowbars and other tools, they discovered a carefully constructed trapdoor that provided access to a root cellar that had been completely concealed from casual observation. The trapdoor mechanism was sophisticated for frontier construction, featuring hinges that allowed it to open silently and a locking system that could be operated from above to prevent anyone trapped below from escaping. The careful craftsmanship evident in its construction suggested that it had been built specifically to facilitate the disposal of murder victims rather than for legitimate storage purposes. The cellar beneath the house contained evidence of systematic violence that exceeded the worst fears of even the most pessimistic investigators. The earthen floor was saturated with what appeared to be human blood, creating a dark, foul-smelling mud that had clearly accumulated over years of repeated use. The walls showed extensive staining and spatter patterns that indicated multiple violent deaths had occurred in the confined space, while the low ceiling bore impact marks suggesting that victims had been subjected to brutal attacks with blunt weapons. Scattered throughout the cellar, investigators found an array of weapons and tools that had obviously been used in the commission of murders. Several hammers of different sizes showed clear evidence of having been used to crush human skulls, with hair, blood, and tissue still clinging to their surfaces despite apparent attempts at cleaning. Kitchen knives bore similar evidence of violent use, while a large wooden mallet appeared to have been the primary weapon used in most of the killings, its surface darkly stained and bearing clear impressions where it had repeatedly struck bone and flesh. But the cellar also revealed the methodical, business-like nature of the Bender family's criminal operation that set it apart from typical frontier violence. They had installed a sophisticated system of pulleys and ropes that could be used to move heavy objects, presumably bodies, through the trapdoor and out to disposal sites on the property without requiring multiple people to handle the corpses directly. The walls showed grooves and marks where bodies had been dragged repeatedly, indicating that this system had been used many times over many years. Most disturbing was the evidence that the space had been designed and modified specifically for its grisly purpose, rather than being adapted from an existing root cellar. The dimensions were wrong for food storage. The floor had been deliberately sloped to facilitate drainage of blood and other fluids, and ventilation had been carefully planned to prevent the accumulation of odors that might alert guests in the rooms above. Every aspect of the underground chamber demonstrated that it had been constructed by people who understood exactly how it would be used and had taken steps to maximize its efficiency for murder and body disposal. As the investigation moved outside, the full scope of the horror became apparent when systematic probing of the soil revealed that the orchard behind the house was actually an elaborate burial ground where victims had been interred over years of systematic killing. The fruit trees, which had appeared to be a normal agricultural feature to casual observers, had been planted specifically to conceal grave sites and provide a plausible explanation for regularly disturbed soil throughout the area. The first body was discovered on the afternoon of May 5th, buried approximately 3 feet beneath a young apple tree that showed signs of recent planting. Dr. William York had been killed by massive blunt force trauma to the skull, with multiple fractures consistent with being struck repeatedly by a heavy object like the mallet found in the cellar. His personal effects, including his medical bag and a considerable sum of money he had been known to carry, were missing, but his body had been left fully clothed and showed no signs of being moved significant distances after death. The discovery of Dr. York's remains provided definitive proof that the Bender family had been responsible for his murder, but it also raised disturbing questions about how many other victims might be buried on the property. Systematic excavation of the orchard area revealed evidence of multiple grave sites, each carefully concealed but marked by subtle changes in vegetation and soil composition that indicated the presence of decomposing organic matter beneath the surface. Just when investigators thought they had uncovered the full extent of the crimes, they made discoveries that revealed an even more disturbing pattern of systematic murder that had been ongoing for years. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And do not forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let us discover together what happens next in this tale of deception and murder that shocked the American frontier. Over the following days, 10 more bodies were recovered from the makeshift cemetery, each telling a story of premeditated murder and robbery that demonstrated the calculating nature of the Bender family's criminal enterprise. The victims ranged in age from a young child to elderly travelers, suggesting that the family had been completely indiscriminate in their selection of targets, choosing victims based solely on their perceived wealth and the likelihood that their disappearances would go unnoticed for extended periods. What united all the adult victims was evidence that they had been killed by massive blunt force trauma to the head, apparently while seated at the dinner table in the main room of the inn. The angle and pattern of the injuries suggested that the victims had been struck from behind while facing forward, indicating they had been completely unaware of their danger until the moment of attack. The positioning of the wounds was remarkably consistent, suggesting that the killer had developed a systematic method for dispatching victims efficiently and with minimal struggle. The physical evidence suggested a horrifying routine that had been refined over years of practice and dozens of murders. Victims would be seated at the dining table with their backs to the canvas partition, placing them directly above the trap door to the cellar where their bodies would eventually be disposed. Kate would engage them in conversation, often conducting impromptu spiritual readings or fortune-telling sessions that kept their attention focused on her, while positioning them precisely where they needed to be for the attack. The discovery that shook even experienced investigators to their core came when they uncovered the remains of 10-year-old Mary Ann Mackenzie, buried separately from her parents in a shallow grave near the vegetable garden behind the Bender house. Unlike the adult victims who had been killed by blunt force trauma to the skull, the examination of the child's remains revealed that she had been buried alive, conscious and struggling, in what represented perhaps the most horrific aspect of the Bender family's crimes. The positioning of Mary Ann's small body within the grave told a story of unimaginable terror and suffering. Her arms were positioned above her head with her fingers extended, and forensic examination revealed that her fingernails contained soil and organic matter, clear evidence that she had attempted to claw her way out of the grave after being buried. The condition of the soil above her burial site showed signs of disturbance that indicated she had continued struggling for some time after being interred, probably suffocating slowly over a period of minutes or hours while trapped beneath several feet of earth. This finding transformed the investigation from a case of robbery and murder into something far more sinister that challenged the understanding of even experienced law enforcement officers who had dealt with frontier violence throughout their careers. The systematic killing of entire families, including children who posed no threat and carried no valuable possessions, demonstrated a level of callousness and cruelty that defied rational explanation. But it was the evidence surrounding little Mary Ann's death that revealed the true psychological depths of Kate Bender's depravity and her role as the mastermind behind the family's criminal activities. Among Kate's personal effects, abandoned in her hasty flight, investigators found a detailed diary that contained entries describing the murders in chilling detail and providing unprecedented insight into the mind of a serial killer. Rather than showing remorse or treating the killings as necessary evils committed for financial gain, Kate had written about them with the detached curiosity of someone conducting scientific experiments, documenting which methods were most effective, how long victims took to die, and whether their spiritual beliefs seemed to affect their final moments. The diary entries revealed that Kate had convinced herself she was performing a valuable service by helping her victims transition to the spirit realm more efficiently than they could accomplish through natural death. She wrote extensively about communications she claimed to receive from the deceased after their murders, describing detailed conversations in which the spirits supposedly thanked her for facilitating their deaths and assured her that they were at peace in the afterlife. These elaborate delusions had apparently allowed her to rationalize the murders as acts of spiritual mercy rather than crimes motivated by greed and callous disregard for human life. But the most disturbing entries in Kate's diary dealt with her experiments in what she called spiritual acceleration. Her systematic attempts to determine whether certain individuals possessed souls that were more readily released from their physical bodies through violent death. She had tested various methods of killing, different types of victims, and even different times of day to see if these factors affected her ability to communicate with the deceased afterward. Her notes described the murders of entire families as particularly valuable experiments, since they allowed her to compare the spiritual responses of victims of different ages and backgrounds who died under similar circumstances. The diary also revealed that Kate had been planning to expand their criminal operation beyond their Kansas location, envisioning a network of spiritualist mediums who could identify suitable victims while their associates carried out the actual murders. She had been corresponding with individuals in Colorado and California who might serve as partners in establishing similar enterprises along other major travel routes, describing detailed plans for creating what would have amounted to the first organized crime network in American history. Her vision extended to creating a systematic method for identifying wealthy travelers throughout the frontier region, using spiritual consultations as a cover for gathering intelligence about potential victims while building the kind of reputation that would deflect suspicion from the actual criminal activities. The scope of her ambitions suggested that the murders at the Bender Inn represented only the beginning of what she hoped to accomplish through the systematic exploitation of frontier hospitality customs. As investigators pieced together the full extent of the Bender family's crimes through examination of Kate's records and the physical evidence from their property, they realized they were dealing with America's first documented family of serial killers. The systematic nature of their operation, the careful planning involved in each murder, and the sophisticated methods used to avoid detection demonstrated a level of criminal organization previously unknown on the American frontier. The physical evidence from the crime scene confirmed that at least 11 people had been murdered at the Bender Inn, but Kate's diary suggested the actual number might be significantly higher when victims from their previous locations in Kansas and Missouri were taken into account. She made cryptic references to spiritual consultations that had ended in death rather than communication with the deceased, and maintained lists of names that corresponded to missing persons reports from throughout the region during the previous decade. Colonel York's investigation had uncovered not just the fate of his brother, but evidence of one of the most extensive serial killing sprees in American history. The Bender family had operated their deadly enterprise for over 20 years, moving from location to location as suspicion grew, always staying one step ahead of law enforcement while claiming new victims along the frontier's busiest travel routes. But even as the full scope of their crimes became clear, the perpetrators themselves remained at large. The Bender family had vanished completely on the night of May 4, 1873, taking with them any hope of bringing them to justice for their heinous acts and ensuring that many questions about their methods and motivations would never be definitively answered. Their disappearance would spawn one of the largest manhunts in American history, while leaving behind a legacy of terror that would change forever how travelers viewed frontier hospitality. The manhunt for the Bender family became one of the most extensive and well-publicized criminal investigations of the 19th century, spanning multiple states and territories while involving both professional law enforcement officers and civilian bounty hunters motivated by the substantial rewards offered for their capture. Despite numerous reported sightings, false leads, and alleged encounters that generated headlines in newspapers throughout the American West, the four members of America's most notorious criminal family seemed to have vanished as completely and mysteriously as many of their victims had disappeared over the previous 2 decades. In the immediate aftermath of the discovery at the Bender Inn, armed posses formed throughout Kansas, Missouri, the Indian Territory, and beyond, following every possible lead about the family's whereabouts and pursuing tips that arrived daily from concerned citizens who believed they had spotted the fugitives. The distinctive physical appearance of Kate Bender, in particular, made her a recognizable figure who should have been difficult to hide among frontier communities where strangers were noticed and remembered. Her unusual height, striking features, and educated manner of speaking created a memorable impression that many people claimed to recall encountering in various locations throughout the West. Yet despite hundreds of reported sightings and numerous claims by bounty hunters and law enforcement officers that they were close to capturing the family, none of the investigations led to verified contact with any of the Bender family members. The vastness of the American frontier, with its countless isolated settlements, unmarked trails, and communities where asking questions about newcomers' backgrounds was considered impolite, provided almost unlimited opportunities for determined fugitives to disappear and establish new identities far from their criminal past. Several theories emerged about their escape route and ultimate fate, each supported by various pieces of circumstantial evidence, but none ever definitively proven. Some investigators believed the family had fled south into Mexico, where the large population of German immigrants in remote rural areas would have provided perfect cover for their integration into existing communities. The political instability and limited law enforcement presence in many parts of Mexico during the 1870s would have made it relatively easy for criminals to disappear permanently, especially if they possessed the financial resources that the Bender family had accumulated through years of robbery and murder. Others suggested they had headed west to California, where the ongoing gold rush had created numerous boom towns filled with transient populations who asked few questions about newcomers' backgrounds or previous occupations. The constant movement of people seeking fortune in mining camps and agricultural settlements would have provided ideal conditions for the family to establish new identities while continuing their criminal activities in locations where their previous reputation was unknown. The most persistent and widely believed theory involved reports that the family had been captured and killed by vigilantes before they could be brought to official justice. In the often lawless environment of the 1870s frontier, summary justice administered by citizen committees was common for crimes considered particularly heinous by local communities. Several witnesses claimed to have seen the Bender family in the custody of armed men near the Colorado border, but no bodies were ever found, and no participants in such vigilante action ever came forward to confirm or deny these accounts. This theory gained credibility from the fact that the rewards offered for the Benders' capture, dead or alive, totaled several $1,000s, a fortune by frontier standards that would have motivated numerous individuals to pursue them. The likelihood that professional bounty hunters or concerned citizens might have chosen to dispense immediate justice rather than risk the family escaping during transportation to trial seemed plausible to many observers familiar with frontier justice customs. Kate Bender herself became the subject of numerous alleged sightings and supposed encounters over the following decades, with reports placing her in locations throughout the American West and beyond. A woman matching her description was reportedly seen operating as a fortune teller in Denver in 1874, conducting elaborate seances that attracted wealthy clients from throughout the Colorado Territory. Similar reports placed her in San Francisco in 1876, where she allegedly operated a spiritual consultation business that catered to prosperous merchants and mining investors seeking guidance about their business ventures. Additional sightings were reported in Oregon, where she supposedly ran a boarding house that catered to travelers along the Columbia River, and in Arizona Territory, where she was said to be offering herbal remedies and spiritual healing services to residents of remote mining communities. However, none of these sightings could be definitively confirmed through official investigation, and it remained unclear whether Kate had managed to escape and continue her criminal activities, or whether the reports represented cases of mistaken identity involving other women who happened to share her physical characteristics. The abandoned Bender property became a macabre tourist attraction that drew curious visitors from across the region who wanted to see the site where America's most notorious serial murders had taken place. The house itself, with its blood-stained floors and hidden trapdoor, became the subject of countless newspaper articles and sensational stories that spread the Bender legend throughout the United States. Eventually, the building was systematically dismantled by souvenir hunters who carried away pieces of the structure as grisly mementos, including sections of the blood-stained floorboards and fragments of the canvas partition that had concealed the family's murderous activities. The land where the Bender Inn had stood was eventually sold and converted to conventional farming operations, but local residents reported that crops grown in the former orchard area never thrived despite the apparently fertile soil. Some attributed this to the disturbed nature of the ground where so many victims had been buried, while others claimed it was evidence that the violent deaths had somehow cursed the land permanently. Regardless of the explanation, the property never again served as a site for hospitality or commerce, remaining instead a reminder of the terror that had once been conducted there. For the families of the victims, the Bender case provided some measure of closure through the knowledge of what had happened to their loved ones, but the escape of the perpetrators left many feeling that justice had not been adequately served. Dr. William York was buried with full honors in Independence, Kansas, with a monument erected commemorating him and the other victims of the Bender murders. The ceremony was attended by hundreds of people from throughout the region, including many who had never met Dr. York but felt compelled to honor his memory and that of the other innocent travelers who had been killed. The case had a profound and lasting impact on frontier hospitality customs, with travelers becoming significantly more cautious about staying at isolated inns operated by unfamiliar families. The Bender murders demonstrated that the traditional trust extended to strangers on the frontier could be exploited by those with criminal intentions, leading to fundamental changes in how communities monitored suspicious activities and investigated unexplained disappearances. Many travelers began carrying letters of introduction from trusted sources and arranging to stay only at establishments with well-established reputations within their local communities. Law enforcement agencies throughout the frontier region used the Bender case as a catalyst for improved communication and coordination between different jurisdictions, recognizing that mobile criminal families could exploit the isolation and poor communication systems that characterized much of the American West. The investigation had revealed how the family had operated across multiple counties and states for years without detection, highlighting the urgent need for better information sharing between local authorities and more systematic tracking of missing persons reports. The psychological aspects of the case, particularly Kate Bender's use of spiritualism as a tool for identifying and manipulating victims, influenced the development of early criminal profiling techniques and contributed to law enforcement understanding of how serial killers operated. Her diary provided unprecedented insight into the mindset of someone who had committed multiple murders over an extended period, revealing how she had rationalized her crimes through elaborate delusional beliefs while maintaining the outward appearance of a respectable and even admirable member of society. Perhaps most disturbing was the realization that the Bender family's crimes might never have been discovered if not for Dr. York's prominent family connections and his brother's determination to investigate his disappearance thoroughly. The systematic nature of their operation and their demonstrated skill at avoiding detection for over 20 years suggested that similar crimes might have been occurring at other locations throughout the frontier region without ever being recognized as connected murders rather than isolated disappearances. The Bender case serves as a chilling reminder that evil can hide behind the most mundane and even appealing facades, and that those who present themselves as helpers, healers, and spiritual guides may sometimes harbor the darkest and most destructive intentions. Kate Bender's ability to gain the complete trust of her victims through her supposed spiritual gifts demonstrates how predators can exploit fundamental human needs for comfort, guidance, and connection with lost loved ones to facilitate acts of unspeakable violence. This mystery shows us that the American frontier, for all its promise of freedom, opportunity, and new beginnings, also provided unprecedented opportunities for those willing to prey upon the trust and vulnerability of their fellow travelers. The isolation that offered independence from social constraints also created conditions where systematic criminal activity could continue for decades without detection. What do you think of this story? Do you believe the Bender family managed to escape justice and continue their crimes in other locations? Or did frontier justice catch up with them in ways that were never officially documented? Leave your comment below and share your theories about what really happened to Kate Bender and her family. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.